have an issue, helping them along that pathway for any temporary permit holders. And I think the last thing I'll say, just to flag in case I haven't or won't get a chance to, someone spoke to, it's the whole issue of processing delays wherever you come along the path. But what I would say from an employer's perspective, I don't know how many, if I was here in person, I'd ask for a show of hands of whoever's had to explain to an employer what implied status is and what that means for possible employment. I think those sort of complicating issues can't be understated. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. It's so good to have all of these different perspectives. I think this is a large panel. We're all taking a little bit, actually you're not over time, Leah, but everybody else has been a couple of minutes over, but I think we're okay. And it's really important to get your message out there and especially laying this base for the discussion later on possible recommendations. So now I'd like to move on to Mikhail Skuterud, who can provide a labor market perspective for us.
Yeah, so can you hear me, Francine?
Yes.
Yeah, so before I start, I should tell you, Francine, do not be shy to interrupt me when you need to. I don't have a planned pitch. Well, I have somewhat of a rough planned pitch here, but not a script. So it's entirely possible I talk too long here. So just yell at me to shut up when the time comes.
No, I won't do that.
So I'm going to actually take a bigger step back than just looking at international students, because I'm already seeing this kind of back and forth on discussion that I've seen a lot of these kind of forums where people come from very different backgrounds discussing immigration. I also see it actually in my own department meetings when we have job vacancies. So when we need to hire somebody in the economics department at University of Waterloo, that is usually the biggest source of confrontation within our department. Because people have very different opinions on what type of a person we should hire. And it's supposed to be this very democratic process that all the professors have their own say. And so there are people that say that, we should be emphasizing somebody who's really good at research. And there are people who say, well, we should be looking for someone who's a really good teacher. And we have people who say, well, the really important thing is that we should be increasing our gender diversity or ethnic diversity in our department. And so you have completely crazy disagreements about who it is we should be hiring. So we've learned over the years, and I don't think we're alone, that the best thing to do is before we start interviewing people, let's sit down and say, what is our objective? And we will never come to a consensus on that, but at least we can have that discussion about what exactly are we trying to achieve here. And then we can have an election and arrive somehow, or a vote, arrive somehow at an agreement on what it is we're trying to achieve. And I think our biggest problem when we talk about immigration in Canada is that we're all coming from different perspectives, where we all have our own vested interests and agendas that we're trying to push forwards, and we're just talking past each other. So I think the most important thing we always need to do when we talk about immigration policy, how many immigrants we should be admitting and who we should be targeting, or maybe we shouldn't be targeting, maybe it should be an open border, but I mean, these are all legitimate questions, but we need to talk about what is it that we are trying to achieve. And the reality is we're trying to achieve more than one objective, very clearly. And that's, I think, what we've realized over the years is that we need different instruments for the different objectives. So that's why we have different programs. And we have, in particular, 3 main arms. I think the most important objectives that we need to distinguish are what we call humanitarian or ethical objectives, which are really about targeting immigrants where we can do the most to improve their well-being. The difference between what their well-being would be if they weren't admitted to Canada and what their well-being is if they are admitted, where those gains can be really large. I think that's what we try to do with humanitarian immigration. And that's a very important objective. And I would argue an objective that, for the worse, has been crowded out over the past 20 years. The other objective is that we can, in kind of a selfish way, leverage immigrants to make us better off who are already here. And that's, I think, more kind of the economic class objective, is that it's not about making the immigrants better. It's not about helping immigrants and making them better off. It's about increasing our economic well-being, who are all the people who are already here. And I think what's happened over time in the past 20 years is that narrative about how immigrants make us all better has completely crowded out whether or not immigration makes immigrants better off, and that objective. Now, coming to the student programs, my take on the student programs, and I could be completely wrong, but I think this is the discussion we need to have, is we have student immigration programs in Canada. What are we trying to achieve with those programs? And my take on the way they've been designed is that they're overwhelmingly economic objectives. They're about leveraging international student immigrants to affect our economy in a way we deem to be desirable. It's not first and foremost about the well-being of immigrants. If it was about the well-being of immigrants, I can assure you we would be targeting very different types of immigrants from very different countries than we are now. And so it's, where that's the most transparent, that I feel like in a lot of the discourse people miss, is that the way, I'm not, this is not a normative statement about whether things should be. I tend to avoid those statements. Just very clearly, what is the situation in Canada? And the situation is we have an economic class program that targets international students, increasingly is targeting international students. And the main screening system is something we called express entry, which uses a point system to cream skim. And that point system has a very clearly defined objective. The point system, I was part of the review process. The way those points were assigned and chosen was it came from a regression analysis that predicted immigrants' earnings after they land in their first 10 years. That's where those points come from in the CRS. That's all it is. So we are selecting people to try and maximize their earnings when they come to Canada. That's not about what's good for immigrants. I mean, it's related, but it's really trying to raise our GDP per capita, because in order to raise GDP per capita, you need new immigrants' earnings to be above the average. The way you pull up an average is to bring in new people who are above the average. And so that's what we're always gauging. And so the reality is that international students have actually been quite successful. They are more successful. There's no question. There's overwhelming evidence that students who are educated in Canada have higher earnings, ceteris paribus, everything else being the same, than students who are foreign educated. And so that's, I think, the reason why the economics literature has shown that, and why the policy has moved towards a preference for international students. It's also a win because post-secondary institutions also benefit from international student tuition fees, which are not regulated, so they can charge whatever they want. And they do take advantage of that inelastic demand that's international students will pay a lot. So then the only other thing I will say is, yes, I think we've clearly moved in a direction, given the objective is to, increase our GDP per capita. Moving towards international students has clearly been the right direction, but that doesn't mean we can't do better. And the reality is still that the students we're selecting are, on average, experiencing integration challenges. Difficulties are very clear. Too often, my feeling is that people automatically think that those problems are entirely due to settlement issues, when in fact, I have some research that we took data from a very large Ontario university. We looked at grades and how they're performing within the same classroom as domestic students at a big university. And the challenges that international students have are very apparent long before they enter the labor market. Those challenges are apparent within the classroom. And a lot of it has to do with language, English and French language abilities. And so a lot of it has to do with how we select immigrants. If our objective is economic growth, if we take that objective, I'm not, it should be, if that is, And I think we can do better. We can screen better. Two things maybe that we don't use to screen are grants earnings while around the postgraduate work permits. We don't use that CRF. And we also don't use students. I have currently a proposal that's close to getting approved of linking students' grades with their T1 earnings. So we can look at what that relationship is. Do we see those? What part of it? I teach in a university, international students in my class. There's a grade distribution there. There's a huge variance between the best students and the worst students. And if I was an employer, I know which ones I'd be picking. There are really highly motivated, highly able students, and then there's some students that are just barely getting by, if they are getting by. The question is, who are the ones who are making the transition to permanent residency? What part of the distribution is settling in Canada? And I can tell you at my university, anecdotally, we know in computer science is one of the most competitive programs in Canada. 80% of the students leave Canada, not because they can't make the transition, but because they get better jobs elsewhere. And I'll tell you what part of the class distribution is. It's not the top end that stay. The top end leave. And so I think if you really want to leverage immigration to raise economic growth, you've got to do a better job, and we've got to do a better job of selection. That's the margin at which you can make a difference.
Great. Thank you, Miguel.
Okay, thanks.
You're raising a lot of really good points. So I did let you go on a bit longer
sorry.
because I thought it was really interesting. And what I'd rather do is have everybody have a moment, like even take, if you have to take a minute or two longer in this part, at least like when we come up with recommendations, maybe that part we can kind of